Welcome back to our conversation about the ethical principle of respect for persons. This is the third of 5 sub-lectures. Thus far, we've talked about setting the stage and looked at the Belmont report that's the source of the principles, and we've gone over the principle of respect for persons. We looked at the flow of the activities and identified characterize, acknowledge, protect, and reconcile as important activities that have to be done in order to apply or think through the respect for persons principle. And now our goal is to apply this to some research situations to see both how it works and also what makes it complicated. So what's next? Examples. So first we can turn our attention to the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is something I mentioned as having motivated the Belmont report. And in this study, there was the use of poor African American males who were monitored. They had syphilis and they were given health care but not treatment for their syphilis. And the goal was to study the progression of syphilis in the human body. And in the middle, we see a certificate for participants, a tool that was used to try to keep people engaged in the study. And in the right, a New York Times article that starts to articulate the sort of outrage when people learned of this particular study. So the issue here is in this Tuskegee syphilis study, what would it have looked like to characterize the people involved? Should we have been protecting them in some sort of way or acknowledging their autonomy and supporting informed consent? Is there reason to have had to reconcile a notion of autonomy with diminished autonomy? So if we look again, re-articulate some of the things that we've said so far. The characterization of who is involved. We have poor African American men who have syphilis, who are monitored over time as their syphilis progressed. So they might have been poor African American men, but they were adult men, and there is really no reason to claim that these men were not autonomous and not capable of making their own decisions, their own deliberations, and thus no reason to protect them in that sort of way. And since there's no reason to protect them, there's not a real issue of reconciling protect or not, protect or acknowledge, which leaves us squarely in the acknowledge their autonomy camp and the goal of supporting informed consent. So let's imagine what it would have looked like to support informed consent of these individuals. We would have needed to think through the information that would be given to the individuals. Might it have looked something like, you have syphilis and you will receive health care, but not specifically to treat your syphilis? So what would they have needed to be given in order to have them informed consent participate in the process? In terms of comprehension, the poor African American men, there certainly would be a need to ensure the information is understood, not have the information communicated to them in overly medical jargon or in complicated sentence structures. And then finally, we would have needed to make sure that the information is able to be understood and is given in such a way that there's no coercion, no intimidation, no misrepresentation, so that they could achieve informed consent. So a question here is, if this was the information situation to support informed consent, could we imagine somebody having participated in this particular study? Who would really participate under certain circumstances? So the research lesson, or the lesson of this research example, is that the Tuskegee syphilis study is an example of what not to do. So let's turn to a more positive example. And the next few examples are drawn from work that's gone on in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, as well as an example that drew attention from people in the department. So let's start first with these medical provider interviews. So one of the researchers in the department is interested in smoking cessation, and particularly the role that technology might be able to play in supporting people's attempts to quit smoking. And she wanted to interview medical providers. There's a sense that the technologies are not as nimble as providers are. Providers do customization, and she wanted to learn from them their thoughts on how they customize smoking cessation activities, and also what roles technology might be. So we're saying, in terms of characterization, professionals who support individuals trying to quit are being asked about their insights and their design thoughts. Is there any reason to protect diminished autonomy? Well, we certainly could assume that medical providers are autonomous. There's no reason to think that they are minors, since they're functioning as medical providers, and there's no reason to think that they have diminished autonomy because of some disease, some kind of mental health condition, since they're working as medical providers. So really, we need to acknowledge their autonomy and think through informed consent. So here, the information that they need to be given, some sense of the type of questions, some sense of how the data will be used. Comprehension is probably not, or was probably not, a particular concern for these researchers. These medical providers are highly educated and very experienced even with medical research, so they might be more easily set up to comprehend the information. And then in the case, the researchers were from the University of Washington with no power or particular influence, so there's no reason to believe that their consent would be anything other than voluntary. And so I offer this example as an example of something that's simply a little bit more straightforward about autonomous individuals and supporting of informed consent and thinking through the issues. So when there's minimal risk, like in this example, it's relatively straightforward. So let's turn to an example that's not exactly as straightforward. A researcher in the department is interested in how children play together. And in fact, the researcher is interested in how neurologically diverse children play, like an autistic child and alongside a child without autism, and the role of technology to support such play. So the researcher wanted a chance to observe children playing with each other to gain inspiration for design opportunities. So here, the children are the test subjects. So characterizing, researchers want to study children. Children are the participants. So when we start here by thinking about the potential to need to protect diminished autonomy, we can note that children as minors are not mature enough to be considered autonomous, and that the consent in this case is to be delegated to the parents. So here, then we acknowledge the autonomy of the parents and support their informed consent on behalf of their children. And once we get to the point where we're supporting the parents making the decision, they need to be told the information that's relevant, such as the type of observations to be made and the goal of the study. In terms of comprehension, the procedure is not complicated. It doesn't involve medical terms. So really the issue is just to keep it simple. In terms of voluntariness, the researchers, again, were from the UW with no power or influence over the parents. And so the nuance in this particular case is that children as minors are not mature enough to be considered autonomous, so we're delegating to the parents. So when you have minors, someone else needs to perform the informed consent. A different example, also illustrating a bit of a nuance. One of our researchers wanted to understand the impact of low belongingness to people's engagement in social media. So in other words, if somebody is feeling like they belong, how do they engage with social media? And if somebody is feeling a lack of belonging, how do they engage with social media? So the goal of the researcher was to find a way to experimentally manipulate somebody's sense of belonging or not belonging, and then look at activities on social media. So what's interesting, and I invite you to think for a second, what would be complicated about this particular situation in terms of characterizing, acknowledging, informed consent, protect, reconcile? So here, getting straight to the point, the researcher wanted to understand the belongingness would affect engagement. And to conduct the study, the researcher needed to manipulate belongingness, and the manipulation would not work if participants knew about it in advance. Specifically, the researcher used an online ball passing game, so a person would interact with some virtual other participants who would occasionally pass them a virtual ball. And although it sounds silly, apparently, if you are not passed the virtual ball in a predictable sort of way, you do start to feel like you don't belong. So this needed to happen to some participants in order for the participants to have low levels of belongingness, but they couldn't be told that in advance because that would disrupt the experiment. So the tweak here is that in supporting informed consent, there is this information about belongingness being manipulated, but you can't tell that to the participants in advance. And it's a kind of deception that can be acceptable as long as the risk is minimal. So in this particular case, you feel, as a research subject, a little put out because you don't get the virtual ball. But it was necessary for the research, and after the experiment, the participant is given then the information about what has transpired. So sometimes research requires deception, but it can be okay if there is minimal risk. And as a final research example, I offer something that caught the attention of some people in the department, an article that appeared in February 2016 about Google's lessons or insights into building the perfect team. What was interesting about the article is that the research findings were pretty compelling. The researchers found that it wasn't the right set of skills or co-location or other standard features of teams that seemed to make them work effectively together. It had a lot more, according to the research. The effective teams were the ones that had high levels of trust. They really worked with each other. They could take risks in front of each other, and that afforded them the opportunity to get farther faster. But the findings of this study are not the specific point. It's the issue about informed consent and respect for persons. So if you were to go online and read the article, after hearing about the background and why the research was done and what other researchers had found, you hit the part where they talk about gaining insights from employees at Google. They say, the researchers scrutinized the composition of groups inside Google. How often did teammates socialize? Did they have the same hobbies? Were their educational backgrounds similar? Was it better for all teammates to be outgoing? They drew diagrams showing which teams had overlapping memberships and which had exceeded their department's goals. They studied how long teams stuck together and if gender balance seemed to have an impact on team success. So what's interesting here is that the participants were Google employees, and their performance in their jobs is being studied in order to understand something about teamwork. Google employees were involved in studies. So the ethical principle of respect for persons says we acknowledge autonomous individuals. So participants as employees of the company were adults and are typically understood to be autonomous. So the question that arose when we were discussing this is, what was the informed consent process? How did Google, in doing this research, gain informed consent from all of these employees to know all of this information about them? What's interesting is it's simply not discussed in the article. But it goes a bit further in terms of the tension between autonomy and diminished autonomy. Looking at the protect point here, as employees of the company, were participants in a position to say no? If participants didn't feel comfortable in saying no to their employer, does that suggest a sense of potential coercion? And since this is a tricky situation, did they deserve some kind of protection? So how do we reconcile the idea of adults autonomously participating with employees of a company needing protection? So the research lesson here, that informed consent can be challenging when research occurs in employment situations. So this lecture has focused on examples and lessons by applying the Respect for Persons principle to different research situations. And in the next video lecture, online lecture, we'll focus on applying the principle of respect for persons to design situations.